Tonight, we are stepping back into the real Wild West. Not the Hollywood version with heroic sheriffs, romanticized duels at high noon, and glittering saloons, but the raw, unforgiving frontier where every breath could be your last. Survival here was never guaranteed, and those who managed to carve out a life did so at an unimaginable cost. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but the truth is, most modern people wouldn't last a single day. There's a reason history remembers it not simply as the West, but as the Wild West. Before we begin, if you're enjoying these bedtime journeys into history, I'd truly appreciate a quick like or even a subscription. It helps more than you know. And I'd love to hear where you were listening from. Leave a comment with your location and the time of night or morning where you are. It's always inspiring to see how our little global community comes together through these stories. So, dim your lights, maybe turn on a crackling fireplace sound or some soft white noise, and let's settle in for tonight's journey together. We are about to explore why you wouldn't survive even a single day in the untamed American frontier of the 1870s. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the American West of the 1870s. The good news? You're about to experience one of history's most legendary chapters firsthand. The bad news? Your chances of surviving have already dropped dramatically. The first thing that hits you is not the sunlight or the sound of roosters, but the smell. It's not the crisp, fresh scent of open plains or pine forests you might have imagined. Instead, the air is heavy with something far less pleasant. The stench of unwashed bodies, animal manure, rotting food scraps, and dry dust that clings to everything. Personal hygiene was not exactly a priority in the Wild West. For many frontier settlers, a proper bath was a monthly luxury, and even that was generous. Some endured entire winters without bathing at all. Water was scarce, and every drop was precious. To waste it on washing your body when you needed it for drinking or cooking seemed almost foolish. When you finally attempt a bath, it's nothing like the steaming showers or bubble baths of modern life. Instead, you might find yourself crouched over a wooden barrel filled with icy, bug-ridden water, splashing just enough over your face and arms to feel human again. And when you rise from your so-called bath, your body aches immediately. Every muscle feels stiff, heavy, and sore. This isn't unusual. It is simply the natural state of someone living on the frontier. Life in the 1870s West was built on constant, grueling physical labor, from dawn until long after dusk. There were no weekends, no paid vacations, and certainly no ergonomic chairs or workplace safety laws. Whether you were a farmer, a miner, a cattle rancher, or a shopkeeper, your body was your primary tool, used and overused until it broke. You may think you work hard today, but frontier labor was something entirely different. Imagine spending 14 hours plowing endless fields under a blazing sun, hauling buckets of water, chopping thick timber, or hacking away in the choking darkness of a mine shaft. Even the strongest men and women often ended up permanently stooped and crippled by their early 30s. It's no surprise, then, that the average life expectancy hovered around just 35 years. And this is only the start of your day. As you step outside your cabin, the cold bites your skin. If it's winter, the inside of your wooden shack may already be below freezing, 20 degrees colder inside than outside, because wood does little to hold warmth. Fuel is precious, and you may have let your fire burn out overnight just to conserve it. If it's summer, the opposite problem awaits. Oppressive heat that soaks through every layer of clothing, leaving you drenched in sweat with no escape. The West offered no relief from the elements. Every season was a test. And speaking of clothing, forget comfort. Men typically owned no more than 2 sets of clothes. Coarse wool trousers or rough canvas pants, paired with scratchy cotton shirts that rubbed raw against the skin. Women endured even worse, forced into multiple layers of skirts, corsets, petticoats, and heavy dresses that reached the ground, regardless of temperature. The elegant costumes you see in old Western films? Pure fiction. For the average settler, clothing was uncomfortable, unwashed, and worn until it literally fell apart. By the time you've dressed, washed, barely, and stretched your aching limbs, your stomach is already growling. Breakfast will not bring much relief. The typical frontier diet consisted of hardtack biscuits, beans, and black coffee. Day after day, meal after meal. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a luxury you might see once a week, if that. Meat, when available, was salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved, since refrigeration did not exist. Diseases like scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, were common, rotting gums and loosening teeth until they simply fell out. Even your precious morning coffee, so central to cowboy legends, would likely disappoint you. Forget the rich aroma of roasted beans. This coffee was often boiled until burnt, then cut with eggshells or even salt to reduce the bitterness. But it contained caffeine, and that alone was enough to keep you going. And before you slip on your boots, don't forget to check for scorpions, snakes, or spiders that might have crawled inside during the night. One careless step could leave you with a venomous bite, miles away from the nearest doctor, with little chance of proper treatment. By the time you step outside your cabin, you've already faced challenges most modern people can hardly imagine. And the sun has only just risen. As you step out of your cabin, one thing becomes painfully clear. You are completely exposed. The frontier landscape stretches endlessly before you. Vast, beautiful, but utterly unforgiving. At first glance, it may look breathtaking. Wide open plains, distant mountains glowing with the early morning sun, a sky so vast it seems endless. But this beauty hides danger. In the Wild West, nature itself was your greatest enemy. The weather could turn on you in an instant. The skies might be clear and blue now, but within minutes, you could be staring down a thunderstorm rolling across the plains, lightning flashing across the horizon, or a sudden tornado tearing through the open land. In the mountains, snow could arrive without warning, burying entire homesteads beneath blizzards that lasted for days. Summer brought its own challenges. The heat could rise well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with no shade, no air conditioning, and no way to escape the burning sun. Settlers frequently collapsed from heat stroke or dehydration, often far from the nearest source of clean water. And then there was the dust. Fine, choking, relentless dust. It crept into your home, your food, your lungs. During the infamous dust storms of the plains, the air itself could turn black, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Breathing became painful, and people sometimes tied damp cloths around their mouths just to survive the choking winds. If you imagined you could simply stay indoors, think again. Frontier homes were often built in haste with whatever materials were available. On the prairies, that might mean sod houses, walls made of dirt and grass stacked like bricks. These dwellings were damp, cold, and crawling with insects. In forested areas, log cabins offered more stability, but they still leaked in the rain and offered little insulation against freezing winters. Central heating did not exist. Neither did electric fans. You survived the elements not because of comfort, but because you had no choice. And the environment wasn't just about weather. The wildlife of the frontier posed constant threats. Wolves and coyotes prowled the edges of settlements, attacking livestock and occasionally people. Bears and mountain lions lurked in forests and hills. Venomous snakes, scorpions, and spiders could be found almost everywhere, sometimes waiting inside your boots, sometimes sliding into your bedroll at night. Insects were their own plague. Mosquitoes carried diseases, gnats swarmed endlessly, and locusts could descend by the millions, devouring entire fields of crops in hours. Settlers sometimes stood helplessly as their year's harvest, their very survival, disappeared in a cloud of beating wings. Even the land itself was treacherous. Rivers had to be crossed without bridges, often by fording on horseback or floating wagons across. Many families lost everything: wagons, supplies, and even lives, when their makeshift rafts capsized in the currents. In the deserts of the Southwest, water was so scarce that travelers could die within hours if they miscalculated their route. And if the wilderness didn't kill you, isolation often tried to. Imagine being days, sometimes weeks, away from the nearest settlement. No telephones, no radios. If a storm destroyed your home, if your crops failed, or if you fell ill, there was no emergency service coming to your aid. You were on your own. The frontier looked endless, but in reality, it was a cage of hardship. You couldn't escape the environment. You could only endure it. And many didn't. By the time you've walked a mile in this landscape, you've already realized surviving here was not about strength alone. It was about luck, timing, and a stubborn will to live. You might think that venturing into town would provide some relief from the harshness of the frontier. After all, civilization should offer safety, comfort, and community. But in the Wild West, towns came with their own set of deadly challenges. As you approach a frontier town, the first thing you notice is the smell. Stronger now, thicker, almost overwhelming. Streets are not paved. They are muddy trails in the rain, choking clouds of dust when dry. Wooden planks serve as makeshift sidewalks, though they rot quickly and creak under every step. Everywhere you see piles of animal waste. Horses and oxen are the main forms of transportation, and their droppings cover the streets. With no organized sanitation or street cleaners, the filth simply builds up. In some towns, manure lays several feet deep in busy areas. And then there is the water supply. Wells are often contaminated, streams are shared with animals, and sewage disposal is almost non-existent. With no understanding of germ theory among common people, disease spreads rapidly. Outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, diphtheria, and tuberculosis sweep through towns, sometimes wiping out half the population within weeks. A simple drink of water or a poorly prepared meal could be fatal. Step further into town and you'll find the saloon, the heart of frontier society. But forget the polished piano players, swinging doors, and glamorous gamblers of Hollywood. The reality is far less romantic. Most saloons were nothing more than rough wooden rooms with a long counter and barrels of cheap alcohol. The whiskey wasn't smooth bourbon. It was often a dangerous concoction of raw grain alcohol mixed with substances like tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it a kick. One drink could knock you off your feet or poison you. And while saloons offered a brief escape from the grinding labor of the frontier, they also brought violence. Arguments fueled by cheap liquor turned into deadly brawls. Guns were everywhere, and with tensions running high, disputes over something as trivial as a card game or an insult could end in bloodshed. Forget the dramatic showdowns of Western movies, with two men squaring off in the middle of the street at high noon. Real frontier violence was chaotic, impulsive, and messy. Shootouts usually happened in the dark, in back alleys, or in crowded saloons where innocent bystanders were just as likely to be shot as the intended target. In fact, many frontier towns had strict gun laws, far stricter than many modern cities. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to check their weapons with the sheriff before entering town. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral began not because of some noble feud, but because a group of men refused to surrender their guns as required by local law. Even if you avoided the saloon, danger lurked elsewhere. Doctors in these towns were often untrained, practicing crude medicine without sterilization, anesthesia, or even basic hygiene. A cut on your hand could lead to an infection that spread up your arm and killed you within days. Surgery, when attempted, was performed with saws and knives, sometimes without pain relief. Amputations were common, survival was rare. Dentistry was even worse. With no drills or anesthetics, rotten teeth were simply yanked out with pliers or chisels, leaving patients screaming in agony. Most settlers lost many, if not all, of their teeth at a young age, living with constant pain until they couldn't bear it anymore. And justice? That was far from guaranteed. Sheriffs, when present at all, were often responsible for hundreds of square miles, leaving most disputes to be settled by vigilantes. Theft, cattle rustling, and murder were frequent. Lynch mobs were common, and the principle of innocent until proven guilty often did not exist. If you were accused of a crime, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset, guilty or not. So while the wilderness outside town threatened you with storms, starvation, and wild animals, the town itself offered little better. Disease, violence, corruption, and crude medical care awaited you behind those wooden facades. By the time you leave town, you may find yourself wondering, which is more dangerous, the wilderness or civilization? Your stomach growls again. You've barely gotten through the morning, and already the hunger gnaws at you. But in the Wild West, food is not about taste, variety, or pleasure. It is about sheer survival. Meals are simple, repetitive, and often barely edible. For breakfast, you may have eaten a hard biscuit and watered-down coffee. Lunch and dinner won't look much different. The frontier diet relied heavily on beans, salted pork, cornbread, and black coffee, consumed over and over until the thought of another bite becomes almost unbearable. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare. Out on the plains or in the desert, produce was nearly impossible to grow. Settlers depended on whatever they could preserve or trade for. which meant that scurvy and other vitamin deficiencies were constant threats. Imagine your gums swelling, bleeding, and your teeth loosening until they fall out, all because you hadn't tasted an orange in years. Meat, when available, was usually tough, heavily salted, or smoked to keep it from spoiling. Without refrigeration, settlers relied on drying, pickling, or curing meat, giving it a texture and taste far from the juicy steaks of modern times. And sometimes, even spoiled food had to be eaten. Starvation was a worse enemy than rotten taste. Coffee, the one comfort many clung to, was often a bitter disappointment. Beans were boiled again and again until they lost all flavor, leaving behind a tar-like sludge. Some settlers tried to improve it by adding crushed eggshells, salt, or even bits of bacon fat. It was harsh, it was strange, but it delivered caffeine, and that was all that mattered. When food ran low, people improvised. Cornmeal stretched into flatbread, wild game if you were lucky enough to catch it, or simply flour mixed with water into a bland paste. Hunger dulled expectations quickly, and while your meals were meager, the work demanded of you was relentless. There were no 8-hour shifts, no weekends, no holidays. Frontier life meant working from sunrise until the last light faded from the sky, every single day. If you were a farmer, you toiled in the fields from dawn, plowing rocky soil, planting by hand, and carrying buckets of water for crops. If you were a rancher, you spent long hours driving cattle across vast distances, often in scorching heat or freezing cold, facing stampedes, predators, and rustlers. Miners had it worst of all. Deep underground, the air was thick with dust and the constant threat of cave-ins. Explosives were crude, equipment unsafe, and accidents frequent. The work scarred lungs, broke bones, and often killed outright. Diseases like black lung and mercury poisoning haunted those who survived long enough to feel the effects. Even those not tied to land or mine were not spared. Shopkeepers hauled crates and supplies, blacksmiths endured heat and burns, and women, often forgotten in frontier stories, carried an even heavier burden. A frontier woman's day began before dawn. She prepared food, fetched water, mended clothes, tended gardens, raised children, and still joined her husband in the fields when extra hands were needed. She might deliver a neighbor's baby in the afternoon, guard her home against predators at dusk, and end the night sewing by candlelight long after the rest of the family slept. And there was no true rest. Even at night, you were never safe. Fires from oil lamps could consume an entire homestead. Bandits might prowl the edges of town. A storm could rip the roof from your cabin. You slept, but always lightly, because tomorrow promised the same unrelenting grind, and perhaps even greater hardship. Daily life in the West was a test of endurance. Every chore was physical, every comfort was scarce, and every moment of rest was haunted by the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed. If daily life in town or on the homestead was harsh, traveling across the frontier was even worse. In the modern world, a journey of hundreds or even thousands of miles can be accomplished in hours with planes, trains, or cars. But in the 1870s, traveling just a few dozen miles could take days of hardship, exhaustion, and danger. The lucky few could afford passage on the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, which stitched the East and West together for the first time. A train ride was expensive and often out of reach for ordinary settlers. For most people, travel meant one of three things: on foot, on horseback, or by wagon. If you were fortunate enough to own a horse, you had an advantage. But horses were costly, not just to buy, but to feed and maintain. A healthy horse might cost several months of wages, and if that horse fell ill, broke a leg, or was injured by predators, there were no veterinary hospitals to heal it. Often, a wounded animal was simply put down, and with it went your only means of transport. Wagons were the most common way to cross vast distances, but they were far from comfortable. Picture a wooden box on wheels, with no suspension, rattling over uneven trails carved through dirt and rock. Every bump jolted your bones. Every mile tested your patience. Motion sickness was common, bones ached constantly, and accidents were frequent. And then there were the roads, or rather, the lack of them. The famous Oregon Trail was less of a road and more of a path worn down by generations of wagon wheels. When it rained, it turned into a sucking swamp of mud that trapped wagons axle deep. In dry seasons, it became a choking desert of dust that blinded travelers and made breathing almost impossible. Crossing rivers was especially dangerous. Without bridges or ferries in many places, settlers were forced to ford the rivers by wagon, floating their belongings on makeshift rafts. The currents were strong, wagons capsized, and families often lost not just supplies but lives. Stories abound of travelers swept away by the mighty Platte or Columbia rivers, their graves left behind on the trail. And then came the statistics. Of the roughly 400,000 people who attempted the Oregon Trail between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 never made it. Think about that. One grave every few hundred yards along a 2,000-mile route. Children, mothers, fathers, buried in shallow, unmarked graves, as families pressed on because they had no choice but to continue. The number one killer was not arrows or bandits, as Hollywood might suggest, but disease. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, claimed tens of thousands. It struck quickly and mercilessly. A person could feel fine at breakfast and be dead by dinner. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and influenza claimed many more. Accidents were almost as deadly. Falling beneath wagon wheels, accidental gun discharges, drownings, and animal injuries were tragically common. Most travelers were inexperienced with firearms, but nearly everyone carried one, leading to a steady stream of fatal mishaps. The mental toll was immense as well. Imagine burying your child in the cold earth and then climbing back onto the wagon to continue westward, because stopping was not an option. Imagine watching a storm wash away your supplies, knowing it could mean death in the weeks ahead. Imagine walking hundreds of miles, your feet blistered and bleeding, because space in the wagon was reserved for children, the elderly, and the sick. And the journey did not end with arrival. For many, reaching California or Oregon brought not prosperity, but disappointment. Families arrived penniless, sick, and exhausted, only to find that land was scarce, work was brutal, and survival remained as uncertain as ever. Travel in the West was not an adventure. It was a gamble with life itself. And for thousands, it was a gamble they lost. When most people imagine the Wild West, they picture rugged white cowboys, stern sheriffs, and lawless outlaws. But the reality was far more complex. The American frontier was not just a land of opportunity for one group. It was a crossroads of cultures, nations, and peoples, often living uneasily side by side. By the 1870s, the West was a patchwork of identities. Mexican families had lived in the Southwest for generations, long before it was absorbed into the United States after the Mexican-American War. Chinese immigrants arrived in large numbers, drawn by the promise of work-building railroads, mining for gold, or running small businesses. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their traditions and languages to the prairies. African Americans, many fleeing the oppression of the South after the Civil War, sought new beginnings as farmers, cowboys, or soldiers. And towering above all of these groups in history and presence were the Native American nations, peoples who had called these lands home for thousands of years before settlers ever dreamed of heading west. Yet diversity did not mean harmony. Instead, it often meant conflict, inequality, and displacement. And Chinese laborers, for example, faced brutal discrimination. They were given the most dangerous and exhausting jobs, often for far less pay than white workers. In railroad camps, they blasted tunnels through mountains with little protection, many dying in accidents that barely made the news. When the railroads were complete, many turned to running laundries or small shops, businesses that kept them alive, but also marked them as outsiders. Hostility grew, sometimes erupting in violence, with entire Chinese communities driven out of towns by angry mobs. Mexican landowners, who had once held vast ranches and farms, found their properties slowly stripped away through legal manipulation, violence, or outright theft. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had promised to protect their rights after the war, but in practice, courts favored Anglo settlers. Many families were reduced from wealthy ranchers to poor laborers within a generation. African Americans also discovered that the West was no escape from racism. Black cowboys made up nearly 1 in 4 of all cattle hands, yet their contributions were often ignored or erased in popular culture. The Buffalo Soldiers, African American regiments of the U.S. Army, played critical roles in protecting settlements and fighting in frontier wars, but they too endured prejudice from both fellow soldiers and the civilians they defended. And for Native Americans, the story was one of profound tragedy. The expansion of settlers into the frontier meant systematic displacement, broken treaties, and deliberate destruction of their way of life. Entire nations were forced from ancestral lands onto reservations, often barren, isolated stretches of land with little water or resources. The government's policies were devastating. Herds of buffalo, central to the survival of many tribes, were slaughtered by the millions, sometimes as deliberate strategy, starving native communities into submission. Children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools, where they were stripped of their language, traditions, and identity, under the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Violence was inevitable. Some tribes resisted, leading to bloody conflicts like the Great Sioux War, the Battle of Little Bighorn, and countless smaller skirmishes. Others tried to coexist, only to find promises broken again and again as settlers poured into their lands. And while Hollywood later simplified this struggle into tales of cowboys versus Indians, the reality was far more tragic, complex, and heartbreaking. The frontier was not a stage for noble duels, but a battleground of survival, loss, and cultural destruction. By walking through a frontier town in the 1870s, you would hear a dozen languages, see faces from across the world, and feel the constant tension that came from diversity without equality. The Wild West was not just wild because of its environment. It was wild because of the human conflicts simmering beneath every interaction. In most Hollywood depictions, women in the Old West appear as background figures. The saloon girl with a bright smile, the farmer's wife waving from a porch, or the school teacher bringing order to a rough town. But the reality was far richer, harder, and often far more inspiring. On the frontier, women carried burdens as heavy as men's, though history has rarely given them equal recognition. Their days began before dawn and stretched long into the night, filled with work that was both physically exhausting and emotionally draining. A frontier wife woke early to prepare meals, not in the convenience of a modern kitchen, but over an open fire or a smoky wood stove. She hauled buckets of water from a well, chopped kindling for fuel, and baked bread or boiled beans for hours at a time. While tending to children, she also patched clothes, preserved food, and helped plant or harvest crops. When her husband or sons were away, she defended the home herself, against wild animals, thieves, or even hostile neighbors. And yet, beyond this crushing domestic load, many women also worked in the fields beside their husbands, plowing, planting, or herding cattle. The line between men's work and women's work blurred in the face of survival. A woman might deliver a calf in the morning, assist a neighbor in childbirth by noon, and still be expected to prepare dinner and wash clothes by evening. For many, there was little choice. Life expectancy was low, and death was common. Widows, sometimes barely out of their teenage years, found themselves raising children and managing farms alone. The frontier demanded resilience, and countless women rose to the challenge, their labor keeping entire communities alive. Still, legal rights for women were scarce. In most territories, married women could not own property independently, could not vote, and often lost custody of their children in divorce. Domestic violence, widely considered a private matter, left women with little recourse for protection. And yet, the frontier also provided unexpected opportunities. With so few women compared to men, communities sometimes valued them more highly, creating small openings for influence. Territories like Wyoming and Utah even granted women the right to vote decades before the rest of the United States, recognizing their essential contributions to survival and settlement. Not all women on the frontier lived on farms or ranches. Some became school teachers, often underpaid and expected to remain unmarried. Others ran boarding houses, laundries, or small shops, finding a measure of independence through business. And then there were those who turned to sex work in saloons or brothels. Far from the glamorous image painted by later stories, these women often entered the trade out of desperation, abandoned by families, widowed, or left without means of survival. Abuse, addiction, and disease were constant companions, and social acceptance was nearly impossible. Yet even in these harsh conditions, women shaped the West in profound ways. They built families, created communities, and preserved traditions in an environment that sought to erase them. Their resilience echoed through generations, even if their names rarely appeared in history books. In the end, women of the frontier were not simply background characters in a story dominated by men. They were the backbone of survival, bearing silent strength in the face of unimaginable hardship. Their stories remind us that the Wild West was not just a tale of gunslingers and outlaws, but of mothers, daughters, and wives who carried the weight of an untamed world on their shoulders. As the sun dips below the horizon, the vast skies of the frontier turn shades of orange, purple, and deep blue. On the open plains, there are no skyscrapers to block the view, no streetlights to chase away the darkness. The night falls heavy and absolute, broken only by the flicker of oil lamps and the faint glow of campfires. But night in the Wild West is not peaceful. It is a reminder of how fragile your life truly is. Inside your cabin, the wooden walls creak against the wind. The roof leaks in more than one place, and the cold seeps in through every crack. There is no electricity, no central heating, no comforting hum of modern technology. Instead, you rely on the dim flame of an oil lamp, careful not to let it tip and set your home ablaze. Fire was one of the greatest fears of frontier families. A single spark could consume everything you owned, with no fire department to call, no hoses to put out the flames. Entire towns were reduced to ashes at least once in their history. Dinner is no feast, another round of beans, salted meat, and maybe a scrap of cornbread. You chew slowly, but your body craves more. Malnutrition gnaws at nearly everyone here, and it shows in the sunken faces and thin frames of your neighbors. As you finish your meal, you hear the distant howl of coyotes. Perhaps it's wolves tonight, or the echo of a mountain lion. The wilderness does not sleep when you do. Outside, predators stalk livestock, insects swarm around the last heat of the fire, and snakes coil in the shadows. Even indoors, you are never truly safe. Lying down to rest, your body aches from the day's endless labor. Your muscles throb, your back stiffens, and your skin burns from sun and wind. You pull a thin blanket over yourself, but the chill cuts through. If it's winter, you shiver violently, praying the firewood will last until morning. If it's summer, you toss and turn, drenched in sweat, breathing thick, hot air with no relief. And then comes the mind. The silence of the frontier is loud in its own way. With no city noise to mask your thoughts, you are left with the constant worry of survival. Will your crops grow? Will bandits strike? Will a sudden storm destroy what little you have? Sleep is never truly restful when tomorrow may bring disaster. For settlers, survival was not a single battle, but an endless war against time, nature, and circumstance. Each night offered only a brief pause before the hardships of another day returned. And yet, in that fragile moment before sleep, many found something else: resilience. The human spirit has a way of enduring, even in the most unforgiving conditions. And though countless lives were lost, though families were broken and cultures erased, there is a strange beauty in the fact that anyone survived at all. The Wild West was not built by legends or heroes. It was built by ordinary people, exhausted, malnourished, frightened, who somehow found the strength to carry on. As the wind howls outside your cabin and the oil lamp flickers low, you close your eyes, not knowing if you'll live to see tomorrow's sunrise. Out here, survival is never promised. It is fought for day after day, night after night. And so, our long day in the Wild West draws to an end. You have woken in a rough-hewn cabin, felt the biting cold of dawn, tasted the meager meals of beans and hard bread, and labored under the relentless sun. You have walked through dusty streets lined with disease and violence, witnessed the dangers of travel along the Oregon Trail, and seen the struggles of women, immigrants, and native peoples in a land where survival was never certain. The frontier has stripped away the romance of Hollywood stories and revealed its true face, one of hunger, exhaustion, danger, and fragile hope. There were no noble duels, no glamorous saloons, no neat divisions of heroes and villains. There were only human beings, ordinary, vulnerable, imperfect, trying desperately to survive another day in a land that cared nothing for them. As you reflect, you realize that the Wild West was never truly tamed by guns or gold. It was endured, painfully and imperfectly, by countless people whose names history has forgotten. farmers who bent their backs until their bodies broke, mothers who carried children while fighting off loneliness and fear, miners who dug until their lungs turned black, immigrants who faced discrimination but still built railroads, towns, and communities, and native nations who fought to preserve their way of life, even as the world around them closed in. Tonight, you've seen that the story of the Wild West is not one of glory, but of resilience. It is the story of people who survived against odds that seem impossible to modern eyes. It is a reminder that comfort, safety, and abundance, things we take for granted today, were once unimaginable luxuries. So as you close your eyes now, let the weight of history settle gently over you. Let the hardships of another time remind you of the strength within humanity, and perhaps within yourself. Breathe deeply, slowly, and allow your mind to wander back across those endless plains, where stars stretched across the sky in silence, and the wind whispered through tall grass. The West was wild, the West was cruel. But through struggle and loss, through hardship and endurance, people found a way to keep going. And now, in this quiet moment, you too can rest. Not with fear of predators at your door, not with hunger gnawing at your belly, but with the comfort of knowing that you live in a different time. A time where the struggles of the past are only stories, guiding you gently towards sleep. Close your eyes. The fire is low, the night is calm, and tomorrow is far away. In the Wild West, survival was never guaranteed. But here tonight, you are safe. You are at rest. Sleep well.